That evening, Meredith was pulling down the metal shutter of her laundromat when Zoe came running from the back, holding up a brown envelope, grinning wide. "Mom, someone stuck this under the door." Her voice was bright, cheerful, like she'd just found a toy someone dropped on the sidewalk. Meredith took the envelope. No name, no return address. She tore it open and pulled out a stack of papers and recognized it immediately. It was a copy of her lease agreement for the laundromat, but there was one page she had never seen before. A supplemental clause, granting the property owner the right to terminate the lease unilaterally within 30 days. That page had not existed in the version she signed. Meredith looked up. Zoe was crouching by the doorstep, a stick of white chalk in her hand, scribbling shapes on the cement. The girl had no idea what her mother was holding. All she knew was that tonight, Mom had promised to make mac and cheese, and that was enough. That was a child's entire world. But Meredith knew. She used to be a lawyer. She knew that contract amendments don't appear out of thin air. Someone was playing a game of chess. And someone else she didn't yet know who wanted her to see the board before the final move was made. Before that week was over, the small piece of paper her daughter had picked up from under the shutter would turn both their lives completely upside down, pulling Meredith into the world of people she had never wanted to know. Sit back, because once this story begins, you won't want it to stop. If this story touched you, hit like and share it so more people can hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time, because the stories coming next are even better. Zoe had been asleep since 9 o'clock. The little girl was hugging her pillow, her breathing steady, her face still carrying a faint streak of white powder on one cheek because Meredith had forgotten to wipe it clean during her bath. Meredith pulled the blanket over her daughter, stood there watching her for a while, then closed the bedroom door with the gentlest care. The apartment behind the laundromat had only 2 rooms. One room was for mother and daughter. The other was both the kitchen and the place where Meredith sat whenever she needed to think. She pulled out a chair, switched on the desk lamp, then took the brown envelope from the cash register drawer where she had hidden it that afternoon. This time, she read more slowly. Not because she hadn't understood it, but because she wanted to be sure she hadn't read it wrong. The supplemental appendix lay at the end of the stack of papers, the page number clearly marked, bearing the landlord's signature but not hers. The clause allowed the property owner to unilaterally terminate the lease within 30 days if there was a change in the purpose of use for the premises. The legal language was standard, the presentation was neat, and it had absolutely not existed in the contract Meredith had signed 3 years earlier. She set the sheet of paper down on the table, leaned back in her chair, and looked up at the ceiling. The water stain on the ceiling had been there since the day she moved in. She had never fixed it because she had never had enough money to even think about repairing a ceiling. There were things in Meredith's life that simply stayed there, broken from the beginning, and she had learned to live with them instead of repairing them. 3 years earlier, Meredith Cole's life looked nothing like this. Back then, she was a brilliant rising star specializing in corporate law, working from the 17th floor of a glass building in downtown Chicago that overlooked the river. She wasn't the best lawyer at the firm, but she was the most meticulous. Her colleagues used to say Meredith read contracts the way other people read detective novels, missing not a single comma, sparing not a single ambiguous clause. Her husband at the time worked in public service with a city law enforcement agency. On the outside, he was a decent man, going to work on time, coming home for meals when expected, knowing how to say the right things at the right moments in front of family and friends. Meredith had believed that for all 5 years of their marriage. She believed it because she wanted to believe it, and because sometimes belief is the cheapest thing a person can give herself when everything around her appears to be fine. Then everything collapsed in less than 3 months. Her husband was dismissed from his job because of serious misconduct during his service. Soon after, an investigation into financial fraud was opened, and Meredith's name appeared in the file not because she was involved, but because the joint account she shared with her husband had been used as one link in a chain of transactions she had known nothing about. She was dragged into the lawsuit like a leaf swept into a current it had never chosen to step into. Her license to practice law was revoked, not because she was guilty, but because the system needed someone to hold responsible, and she had been standing too close to the person who had caused it all. The divorce came after that. Then, the loss of the house. Then the calls from friends grew fewer and farther between, until they stopped completely. because people didn't know what to say to someone whose entire life had changed in the span of a single summer. 3 years later, Meredith had rebuilt her life at the Southside laundromat. Not rebuilt in any glamorous sense. It was the kind of rebuilding a person does when she picks up each broken brick, wipes it clean, then places it back where it used to be, knowing the wall will never stand as straight as it once did. She opened the laundromat because it was the only thing she had enough capital to begin. She leased the space because it was the only place where the rent fit the money she had left. And she stayed because, after 3 years, the people in the neighborhood had grown used to her face, used to her shop, used to bringing their laundry in every Monday morning and picking it up every Wednesday afternoon. It wasn't success, but it was survival. And there are times in life when survival is already enough. Now, in the small room with the desk lamp giving off a faint hum and her daughter's breathing drifting through the thin wall, Meredith looked again at the strange appendix. She had read enough contracts in her life to know that an unsigned supplemental appendix had no legal value. But she also understood enough to know that someone had prepared this paper in advance, which meant someone was planning something, and that plan was directly tied to the space where she lived and worked. The envelope had been slipped under the rolling door, not mailed, not delivered by hand. Someone wanted her to see this paper, but didn't want her to know who they were. What did that mean? It meant the sender wasn't necessarily an ally, and not necessarily an enemy either. Maybe both. Maybe someone was using her as a move in a chess game whose full board she still couldn't see. Meredith folded the paper again, put it back in the drawer, and locked it. She turned off the desk lamp, but didn't stand up right away. She sat in the dark for a while, listening to the industrial washing machines in the front room, still murmuring because she had forgotten to shut them off completely. Someone didn't just want her to know. Someone wanted her to act. The question was, in which direction and for whom? At the same time, on the other side of the city, in the back room of a small Italian restaurant on West Randolph Street, another man was sitting there listening to a lie. The restaurant had been closed since 10 o'clock that night, but the back room was still lit, because the back room of this restaurant had never truly belonged to the restaurant. It belonged to Reed Gallagher, and the meetings that took place in that room never had anything to do with menus or reservations. Reed was 33 years old, sitting behind the old oak desk his father had left him, his back against the chair, both hands resting on the tabletop, listening as a man named Whitmore explained why he couldn't pay the full rent for his commercial space that month. Whitmore said business was hard, that the revenue from his electronics store had declined for 3 months in a row, that he was having to cut staff, and that if the rent wasn't reduced, he might have to close the store. Whitmore talked a lot. Reed didn't say anything. He only sat there and listened, his eyes fixed directly on Whitmore's face, with the look of a man counting how much truth there was in the story he had just been told. When Whitmore finished, Reed opened the laptop on the desk, turned the screen toward him, and let Whitmore see for himself. On the screen was a screenshot from social media, posted 2 weeks earlier, showing Whitmore standing beside a new sports car, smiling broadly, with the caption he had written himself beneath it, "Work hard, play hard too." The room fell silent. Whitmore opened his mouth to explain, but Reed had already lifted one hand, lightly, without needing to be forceful, just enough for Whitmore to understand that his part of the conversation was over. Reed said, his voice even, neither rising nor falling. "I don't punish people for telling the truth, but I remember the faces of people who lie." Whitmore stood up and left. Before noon the next day, the full rent had been transferred. That was how Reed Gallagher operated. No shouting, no slamming his fist on the table. No need for anyone to fear him the way people feared loud noises. People feared Reed because he knew. He knew everything. Knew it before people had time to think about lying. And that knowledge was what made people careful when they sat across from him. The Gallagher organization wasn't something anyone could find on any business registry. It existed in the lower layer of Chicago, where real estate, private finance, and unofficial business operations intertwined like tree roots beneath a sidewalk, unseen by anyone, yet holding the whole surface from collapsing. Reed controlled most of the commercial spaces in 4 neighborhoods on the city's south side, not through documents bearing his own name, but through a system of subsidiaries, partners, and names that only insiders knew, all led back to the same place. He had one rule his organization knew as clearly as its own name: don't touch innocent people. Don't get involved in anything that destroys the community. That rule didn't make Reed a good man, but it made him the kind of man a community could live beside without having to close its eyes too tightly. After Whitmore left, another man walked in. This man didn't need to knock, because he belonged to this room more than anyone except Reed. His name wasn't important. What mattered was that he carried a file and began to report. The list of rent payments for the month, who had paid on time, who was late, who was trying to ask for a reduction. On that list, there was one small line the reporting man mentioned, almost like a side note: the laundromat on the south side, on time for the 34th consecutive month, never once short, never asking for a single dollar off. Reed didn't say anything, but he gave a slight nod, the kind of nod a man gives when he takes note of something rare. Then the reporting man moved on to the second piece of news. Bryce Gallagher, Reed's older brother, had appeared in the South Side area during the past week, met privately with 3 women who held influence in the community, and given them invitations to a charity fundraiser. When Reed heard that sentence, he stopped. Not because he was surprised, he stopped because he was calculating. Bryce Gallagher was Reed's older brother, 3 years older than him, and on paper, he was a legitimate real estate businessman with his own company, broad social connections, a presence at charity events, and photographs taken beside local politicians. But between the Gallagher brothers, there was a crack outsiders couldn't see, like a fissure in a load-bearing wall, still smooth on the outside, but long since split within. Reed knew Bryce. He knew his older brother in the way only people who grew up in the same house could know each other, knew even the things that man didn't want anyone to know. And Bryce showing up on his own in the South Side, on territory Reed controlled, without saying a word beforehand, wasn't an oversight. Bryce didn't do anything without calculating first. Reed gave 2 orders. First, find out about the woman who owned the laundromat on the South Side, what her name was, what her background was, why she was there. Second, from now on, if anyone in the organization had anything at all to do with that property, they were to report to him before doing anything. The investigation results came back before Reed had time to finish his second cup of coffee. The file confirmed what Reed had suspected. Meredith Cole was no ordinary laundromat owner. Her fall from the top of Chicago's legal world had been swift, leaving her with nothing but a daughter to protect and a relentless eye for detail. Reed read the file once, slowly, then closed it. He said 2 words: put it away. But he didn't say, erase it. And in Reed's world, the difference between those 2 phrases was greater than outsiders could imagine. The phone on the desk vibrated. Bryce's name appeared on the screen. Reed picked up, listening as his brother spoke about a development project on the South Side. Bryce's voice relaxed and confident, as though he were sharing good news rather than crossing into his younger brother's territory. Reed listened from beginning to end, didn't interrupt, didn't ask, didn't answer with a single word. Then he hung up. He set the phone down on the desk, and his eyes returned to the rent report, stopping on the line for the South Side Laundromat, the 34th month, on time, paid in full. The next morning, Meredith opened the laundromat at 6:30, the way she did every day. She pulled up the rolling door, turned on the lights, checked the 3 industrial washing machines and the 2 dryers, then opened the faucet to flush out the suds that had collected in the pipe overnight. The laundromat wasn't large. 2 rows of plastic chairs for customers waiting for their laundry, a pressed wood cashier counter with worn corners, and the smell of detergent mixed with the heat rising from the dryers, creating the particular kind of air Meredith had grown so used to that she no longer noticed it. She began the workday in the exact sequence she had repeated more than 1,000 times, taking in clothes regular customers had left in bags outside the door the night before, sorting them, loading them into machines, writing them down in the ledger, calculating the charges. Her hands went through the motions while her mind was somewhere else, because that morning, her mind was still in the dark room from the night before, with the contract appendix lying inside the locked drawer. Around 9 o'clock, her phone vibrated. The name on the screen was Attorney Patterson, the man who had represented her in all 3 appeals to restore her license to practice law. Meredith answered and listened. Patterson didn't speak at length. He was the kind of man who considered stretching out bad news a form of disrespect, so he said it plainly. The 3rd appeal had been denied by the review board. The stated reason in the written decision was that there wasn't enough new evidence to reconsider the revocation of her license, and he advised Meredith to think carefully before filing again, because each rejection would make her file look weaker in the board's eyes. Meredith listened, said thank you, then hung up. She stood beside washing machine number 2, still holding the phone in her hand, staring into the space in front of her without seeing anything. 3 times. 3 times she had filed. 3 times she had rewritten the entire record. 3 times she had believed the system would see the truth, and 3 times the system had answered that her truth wasn't heavy enough to be placed on the scale. Washing machine number 2 beeped to announce the end of its cycle. Meredith put the phone into her pocket, opened the machine lid, transferred the clothes to the dryer, then loaded the next batch. Because clothes didn't know what news she had just received. Clothes only knew they needed to be washed, and that was her job. That evening, after closing the laundromat, Meredith didn't go back to the apartment right away. She sat on one of the plastic chairs meant for customers, opened her phone, and began doing the thing she had tried not to do for the past 3 years. She searched. Not the way an ordinary person searches for information. She searched like a lawyer, like someone who was used to reading hundreds of pages of documents in order to find the one line that didn't match. She went to the public business registration website for the city of Chicago, then moved to the real estate transaction database, the kind of data most ordinary people didn't know they could access for free if they knew where to look. And Meredith knew where to look. She typed in Bryce Gallagher's name. The results that appeared weren't many, but they were enough. Over the past 2 years, the real estate company registered under Bryce's name had completed 6 purchases of commercial properties in the South Side area. 6 properties, 6 different addresses. But when Meredith looked closely, she saw a pattern repeating itself so clearly, it almost seemed deliberate. All 6 properties had previously been occupied by small tenants, a grocery store, a shoe repair shop, a secondhand goods store, people who had rented their spaces for years, then suddenly had not had their leases renewed. After the tenants left, the properties were sold to Bryce's company at below market value. Approach, appear helpful, then take over. 6 times, the same way. Meredith set the phone down on her lap and looked out toward the storefront. The streetlight outside flickered because the bulb was close to burning out, a light that was neither bright enough nor dark enough, just like the feeling inside her at that moment, knowing enough to worry but not enough to be certain. Then she remembered an afternoon from a few months earlier. That day, someone from the Gallagher organization had come to the laundromat to pick up several sets of washed and dried clothes, and Reed had come with him. It was the only time she had ever seen Reed step into the laundromat. He had stood near the counter, talking on the phone, and Meredith had been in the back folding laundry, close enough to hear a single sentence from his mouth. Bryce is acquiring properties without going through me. Tell him to stop. Reed's voice then had been cold, brief, like a man holding back something much larger than irritation. Meredith hadn't understood that sentence at the time. She had only thought it was an internal matter in a family that had nothing to do with her. But now, sitting in the darkened laundromat with 6 real estate transactions on her phone screen and a strange contract appendix inside the drawer, that sentence returned with an entirely different weight. Meredith didn't have direct proof that her laundromat was the next target. Those 6 other properties were at different addresses, and no one had mentioned her name in any record. But the pattern was clear, and the strange appendix in the envelope, the thing someone had deliberately slipped under the rolling door of her shop, was beginning to fit into the picture in a way she couldn't ignore. She turned off her phone, stood up, switched off the laundromat lights, and went into the apartment. As she passed Zoe's bedroom door, she stopped to listen to her daughter's steady breathing, then kept walking. Something inside Meredith had begun to stir, something 3 years of washing clothes and folding laundry had pressed down, but hadn't killed. The instinct of someone who had once read thousands of pages of contracts and found the line someone else wanted to hide. That instinct wasn't dead. It had only been sleeping, and tonight it had opened its eyes. Delia Watts's hair salon stood on the corner of Martin Luther King and Halsted, and it had been open since before Meredith ever moved to the South Side. And even before that, before most of the people now living in the neighborhood had ever known that address. Delia was 61 years old. She had cut hair for 3 generations of women in the community, and her salon wasn't only a place where people came for haircuts. It was a place people came when they needed to talk to someone without having to explain why they needed to talk. Delia knew everyone's stories, not because she was nosy, but because people told them on their own when they sat in her chair and let her touch their hair. There was something about sitting still while another person cared for the most visible part of you that made people loosen their grip on the most hidden parts of themselves. On a weekday afternoon, when the salon was quiet and Delia was wiping down the mirror, a man she had never seen before pushed the door open and stepped inside. Bryce Gallagher was wearing a pale blue shirt, no suit jacket, no tie, as though he had calculated that dressing too formally on the South Side would create distance. And he didn't want distance. He smiled before he spoke, the kind of smile practiced by a man who had trained himself to let the smile arrive before the words, because he knew people trusted a smile faster than they trusted sentences. Bryce introduced himself as a real estate investor, saying he had been watching the South Side's growth for a long time and believed this community deserved proper investment. He asked Delia about the neighborhood, about the changes over the past 10 years, about what the community needed. He asked the right questions, in the right voice, at the right pace, with the attention of a man who seemed to be truly listening, and the skill of a man guiding the conversation exactly where he wanted it to go, without letting the person across from him realize she was being guided. Then Bryce mentioned Meredith, not in a casual way, in the way of someone who had known in advance and had been waiting for the right moment to bring her name into the conversation. He said, "I hear the woman who owns the laundromat here works very hard. Next week, I'm holding a charity fundraiser for the community. If she comes, I may be able to help her find a way to move from renting the property to owning it. That's the kind of support I want to bring to deserving people on the South Side." He placed 3 invitations on the counter, beside Delia's jar of cutting tools, added a few polite words, then left. The entire meeting lasted no more than 15 minutes. But those 15 minutes were enough for Bryce Gallagher to plant exactly what he wanted to plant, in exactly the soil where he wanted it planted. Delia stood looking at the 3 invitations on the counter for a long while after Bryce left. Then she picked up the phone and called 2 people. Gloria Marsh, 55 years old, the owner of a small household goods stall 2 blocks away, a sharp, direct woman who often acted first and thought later, but who always had a conscience that caught up with her a few days afterward. And Pearl Hammond, 58 years old, a widow who lived alone in the 3rd-floor apartment at the end of the street, so quiet that many people thought she was cold and withdrawn, when in truth she simply didn't speak before she had finished thinking. The 3 women met at the hair salon that afternoon. Delia told them about her meeting with Bryce. Gloria listened and said at once, "This is an opportunity for Meredith. That girl needs a door," and a door just opened. Pearl said nothing for a while, then asked, "How did he know her name?" Delia answered, "He probably did his homework before coming. Someone investing in a neighborhood has to know the neighborhood he's investing in." Pearl gave a slight nod, but said nothing more. Her question hung in the air for a while, then was carried away by Gloria's enthusiasm and Delia's decisiveness. The 3 women made up their minds. They would bring the invitations to Meredith, and they would pool their money to buy her an outfit suitable for the event, because no one went to an investor's fundraiser in jeans and a laundromat t-shirt. The next afternoon, the 3 women came to Meredith's laundromat. Delia walked in first, Gloria carried the garment bag, and Pearl followed behind them. Delia placed the 3 invitations on the counter, right beside the place where Meredith had set the brown envelope a few days earlier, then said, "Girl, this kind of opportunity doesn't come knocking twice. Someone wants to help you move from renting this place to owning it. All you need to do is show up, meet him, talk, and let people see that you deserve it. Don't let pride block the road." Gloria opened the bag, took out the outfit, and hung it on a hook beside the row of dryers. "We all chipped in and bought this for you. It's not a gift. It's an investment. When you buy the shop, you can pay me back then." Pearl stood by the door without saying anything, only watching Meredith with the eyes of someone waiting to see her reaction before deciding what to think. Meredith looked at the 3 invitations, looked at the outfit on the hanger, looked at the 3 women standing in her laundromat with the faces of people who believed they were doing something good. And she understood that refusing now wouldn't only be refusing 3 invitations, Refusing Delia Watts on the South Side was like refusing the neighborhood itself. It meant she thought herself above the community's concern, and that was a position no woman living here could afford to stand in. So Meredith accepted. She thanked them in exactly the voice gratitude required, lowered her head by exactly the proper measure, and waited for the three women to leave the laundromat with the satisfied steps of people who believed they had just opened a door for someone. Once the shop was empty, Meredith picked up one of the invitations. The paper was thick, beautifully printed, with the real estate company's logo in the upper right corner, and below it, printed in small but clear letters, was the name Bryce Gallagher. She had seen that name the night before on her phone screen, besides 6 commercial property purchases on the South Side. Kindness usually didn't arrive with an invitation bearing the name of the man buying up property in your neighborhood. Meredith put the invitation into the drawer, in the same place as the brown envelope. The two things lay beside each other in the dark, and she had the feeling they belonged to the same story, one whose first page was all she had managed to read. The fundraiser was held on the second floor of a hotel in downtown Chicago, the kind of hotel Meredith had once visited often when she was still a lawyer, and hadn't set foot in for the past 3 years. She came alone, wearing the outfit the 3 neighborhood matrons had bought for her, and stood outside the ballroom doors for about half a minute before going in. Not because she was afraid, but because she was reading the room from the outside before allowing the room to read her. It was an old habit from the days when she still attended contract negotiations, always observing before anyone had a chance to observe her. The ballroom wasn't too large, but it was enough for Meredith to recognize at once that she was the only person here who didn't belong here. The people in the room spoke to one another with the familiarity of those from the same class, knowing one another's names, one another's companies, knowing who needed what from whom. Meredith didn't know anyone, and no one knew her. But she knew how to stand in a room without looking like someone who had wandered into the wrong place. 3 years of washing clothes hadn't erased that. Bryce Gallagher found her before she had time to pick up a glass of water. He appeared from the left, walked over with a smile already prepared on his face, and began speaking to Meredith in a warm but controlled voice, the kind of voice belonging to a man carrying out a process he had repeated so many times that it had become instinct. Bryce asked about the laundromat, asked how long she had been running it, whether business was steady, how the neighborhood had changed over the past few years. He talked about his vision for developing the South Side, about the potential the community was wasting, about how investment in the right places could change the life of an entire neighborhood. Meredith listened and nodded at the right moments. But while her ears listened to Bryce speak, her eyes were looking at something else. She watched the way Bryce asked questions. They weren't the questions of someone who wanted to know her. They were the questions of someone measuring how much she knew. He asked whether she knew who owned the building where the laundromat was located, asked whether she had ever thought about buying it instead of renting, asked whether she knew anyone in the local real estate world. Each question was gentle, each one reasonable when heard on its own. But when placed side by side, they formed a map, and that map wasn't meant to help Meredith. It was meant to determine what Meredith knew, what she had, and what she lacked. Then Bryce left to greet other guests, and Meredith stood alone for a few minutes. She used that moment to observe. She saw Bryce speak to 3 different groups of people within 10 minutes, and with each group, he used almost the same set of words, the same rhythm, the same way of tilting his head when listening and nodding when answering. Development vision, community potential, investment in the right places. The same script handed out to different audiences. Meredith didn't need anyone to tell her what Bryce was doing. She had read enough contracts in her life to recognize when language was designed to conceal rather than communicate. About half an hour later, Bryce returned, leading Meredith toward a small group of people he introduced as development partners for the Southside project. He began introducing Meredith to the group, calling her a promising small business owner from the South Side. And at that exact moment, a man walked over. He didn't walk quickly, didn't push his way in, didn't do anything to draw attention. He simply appeared beside the group as though he had been there all along, and everyone else had only just noticed. Reed Gallagher didn't look at Bryce. He looked straight at Meredith, held out his hand, and said, "Reed Gallagher, I hear you have the best laundromat on the South Side." His voice was calm, neither rising nor falling, like a man saying an ordinary sentence. But no one in the group thought it was an ordinary sentence. Bryce smiled, the kind of smile where the mouth performed the right motion, but the eyes failed to follow. He said, "My younger brother always knows how to make an impression." Reed didn't respond to that. He kept looking at Meredith, and Meredith looked back at him. She recognized this man at once, not because she knew his face, but because she remembered his voice. The voice she had heard over the phone at the laundromat a few months earlier, cold and brief, saying the sentence, "Tell him to stop." She shook Reed's hand, felt his dry palm, his firm grip, and held it for exactly 3 seconds before letting go, neither shorter nor longer than necessary. Then Reed left, as quickly as he had come, without saying another word to Bryce or to the investment group. He had finished what he had come to do, and it had nothing to do with the fundraiser. After Reed left, Bryce turned to Meredith, his voice still light but carrying something that hadn't been there before, like the faint sound of metal touching metal behind a layer of cloth. "You know Reed?" Meredith answered. "Who on the South Side doesn't know the Gallagher name?" She said nothing more. And she realized that precisely because her answer said nothing specific, it made Bryce look at her for 1 second longer than normal. That night, Meredith went home on the last bus, sitting in the very back row, watching the city slide backward past the window. She returned home with two certainties. First, Bryce Gallagher was more dangerous than the 6 lines of transactions on her phone screen had suggested, because he wasn't only gathering properties, he was gathering people, gathering trust, gathering every small relationship and arranging them into a chessboard only he could see in full. And second, Reed Gallagher was watching everything more closely than she had thought, and his appearance in the middle of the fundraiser hadn't been to help her or to make an impression. He had come to see how Bryce would react when interrupted in the middle of the game. Meredith was the chess piece both brothers were watching, and she knew that clearly. But she also knew something neither of them knew yet. This chess piece knew how to read the board. 4 days after the fundraiser, Bryce Gallagher returned to Delia Watts's hair salon. But this time, he didn't smile before he spoke. This time, he pushed the door open and walked in with the steps of a man who didn't need to be invited, sat down in the waiting chair without asking, and waited until Delia had seen off her last customer before opening his mouth. Delia noticed the difference the moment she looked at his face. The last afternoon, Bryce had brought a smile and invitations with him. This afternoon, he brought nothing but the thing Delia had lived long enough in this world to recognize, even before it was spoken aloud, and that was pressure. Bryce spoke plainly, no circling around, no asking after the neighborhood, no mention of development, vision, or community potential. He said the situation had changed, that the South Side Development Project was being accelerated faster than expected, that Meredith's laundromat was inside the planning zone, and that property needed to be transferred. Meredith needed to sign the paperwork assigning her lease rights to Bryce's company, and in return, she would receive compensation and a good recommendation to find a space in another area. He said it in a calm voice, like a man presenting a reasonable business arrangement that benefited both sides. But Delia didn't hear an arrangement. Delia heard an ultimatum. She said, "You said you were going to help that girl buy the property. I brought you to her because I believed that." Bryce looked at Delia, and he no longer bothered hiding the change in his eyes. He said, "Plans change. The neighborhood needs development. A laundromat isn't development. You should understand that I'm giving her a way out, not driving her away." Then Bryce said something Delia hadn't expected. He said that if the 3 women, Delia, Gloria, and Pearl, could convince Meredith to cooperate and sign the transfer quietly, then Delia's hair salon lease would also be extended long-term. He said it like a reward, like repayment for help rendered. But behind the reward was the other side of the coin, the side he didn't need to say aloud, because Delia understood well enough. If they couldn't convince her, then this hair salon, the shop Delia had kept open for more than 30 years, was also inside the planning zone. Bryce stood up, fastened the button of his jacket, said, "Think about it," and walked out of the shop. The door closed behind him, and Delia stood alone in the middle of the salon, still holding her scissors, staring through the glass door without seeing anything outside, because her mind was turned inward, back to the afternoon the week before when she had brought the 3 invitations to the laundromat and told Meredith that this was the kind of opportunity that didn't come knocking twice. She called Gloria and Pearl over that very afternoon. The 3 women sat inside the closed hair salon, half the lights turned off, and Delia repeated every word Bryce had said. After Gloria heard it, she stood up, paced back and forth across the salon twice, then stopped and said, "We brought that girl to the wolf without knowing it." Her voice wasn't angry. It was the voice of someone seeing her own mistake clearly, and not yet knowing where to put it, so it would feel less heavy. Pearl had sat silent from the beginning, both hands resting on her lap, her eyes lowered to the floor. She was the quietest of the three, but when she spoke, both Delia and Gloria stopped to listen, because Pearl never opened her mouth before she had finished thinking. Pearl said, "The problem isn't the wolf. The problem is that we opened the pen." That sentence fell into the room and stayed there, heavy, impossible for anyone to pick up, because Pearl was right. Bryce might have been the one who set the trap, but the three women in that room were the ones who had led Meredith closer to it, with the invitations, with the outfit they had bought together, with the earnestness of people who believed they were doing something good and hadn't stopped long enough to ask why that good thing had arrived so easily. They were trapped. Telling Meredith the whole truth meant admitting they had been wrong, that their kindness had been used, that the door they thought they were opening for Meredith was actually the door Bryce wanted opened for himself. Admitting that on the South Side, where the voices of these three women carried a weight almost like law, wasn't a small thing. It meant their credibility would be damaged. It meant the neighborhood would know that Delia Watts, the woman everyone trusted, had been turned into an unwitting accomplice by a strange man with 15 minutes and 3 invitations. But silence wasn't a choice either. Silence meant complicity. Silence meant watching Meredith walk into the trap they had helped set and pretending they didn't know. And all three women in that room, different as they were in temperament, shared one thing they had kept their whole lives and weren't ready to lose, and that was the ability to look into the mirror each morning without having to turn away. Delia said nothing after she finished telling them. She sat in the barber chair, her back against the mirror, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the glass door. Pearl stood first, said, "Let me think on it a little more," and left. Gloria followed, but before she reached the door, she turned back to look at Delia and said, "You won't sleep tonight." Delia answered, "Why say what I already know?" Gloria left. The hair salon returned to silence, and Gloria was right. That night, she didn't sleep. But it wasn't only Gloria. Delia stayed awake too, sitting at her kitchen table, looking at the two hands that had held scissors for more than 30 years, wondering what those hands had accidentally cut away that should have been kept whole. Pearl also stayed awake, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, thinking about the sentence she had said in the hair salon. "The problem isn't the wolf. The problem is that we opened the pen." She thought it over and over again, and realized that knowing where the problem lay didn't mean knowing how to fix it. Sometimes, knowing you were wrong was the easy part. The hard part was deciding what you would do with that knowledge. Meredith didn't know exactly what had happened between Bryce and the 3 neighborhood matrons. No one told her, but she sensed that something had changed in the way the neighborhood looked at her, in the way only someone who had lived long enough inside a small community could feel. Not through words, but through the spaces between words. The woman who owned the grocery store at the head of the street still greeted her every morning, but her eyes lingered on Meredith's face longer than usual, then turned away faster than usual. The 2 women standing outside Delia's hair salon fell silent when Meredith walked past, and once she had passed them, the voices behind her rose again, but softer than before. It was a language that needed no translation. The neighborhood was talking about her, and the neighborhood was hiding something from her. Gloria Marsh stopped by the laundromat on a weekday afternoon. She came alone, without laundry, without the usual Gloria who was direct and said whatever she thought. That day, Gloria spoke in circles in a way Meredith had never heard from her before. She asked about work, asked whether the shop had been busy, asked whether Meredith had ever thought about expanding the business. Then she asked, in a voice trying hard to stay ordinary while her eyes failed to do the same, "Girl, do you know anyone outside the South Side? Is there somewhere else you could? I mean, if you needed to, sometimes a change of place can be good." Meredith looked at Gloria and didn't answer the question. Instead, she asked, "Miss Gloria, is there something you need to tell me?" Gloria opened her mouth, then closed it again. She looked down at her own hands, then toward the door of the shop, then back at Meredith with the eyes of someone standing on the line between speaking and staying silent. And in the end, she chose silence. She said, "Nothing. I'm just worried about you. These days, whatever you can hold on to it, girl." Then she left. Meredith stood there watching Gloria walk out of the laundromat, and she knew with the instinct of someone who had spent years reading an opponent's body language in negotiation rooms, that Gloria had come to say something important and hadn't been able to say it. And Gloria's inability to say it meant the thing was serious enough to make a woman as straight as a thread bend herself out of shape. The three neighborhood matrons were hiding something from her, and that something was connected to this laundromat. That night, after closing the shop, Meredith went into the apartment and saw the outfit hanging from the hook beside the wardrobe. The outfit Delia, Gloria, and Pearl had pooled their money to buy for her to wear to the fundraiser. It had been hanging there since the night she came back from the event, and she hadn't put it away because she hadn't known where to put it. It didn't belong in her closet, just as she hadn't belonged in that ballroom that night. Meredith stood looking at the outfit for a long while. And for the first time since moving to the South Side, she saw the past 3 years of her life more clearly than ever. 3 years in which she had taken pride in standing on her own. 3 years in which she had paid rent on time, never asked for a reduction, never owed anyone, never leaned on anyone. 3 years in which she had believed that as long as she stood on her own 2 feet, no one could push her down. But on the night of the fundraiser, she had worn clothes someone else had bought, gone to an event someone else had arranged, stood in a room someone else controlled, shaken hands with a man someone else had chosen for her to meet. And when Reed Gallagher walked over, she had stood there, between the Gallagher brothers, not because she had chosen to stand there, but because someone else had placed her in that position. She had become the thing she hated most, a person being arranged, a person whose life was being written by others, while she stood by and watched. The last time that had happened was when her ex-husband used their joint account without telling her. That time, she had lost her law license, lost her house, lost everything. And she had sworn to herself that she would never let it happen again. But it was happening again. The only difference was that this time, it wasn't one man deceiving her. It was an entire system, from Bryce Gallagher to the 3 neighborhood matrons to the invitation to the fundraiser, all of it operating around her. And she had only realized it once she was already in the middle. Meredith took the outfit down from the hook, folded it neatly, placed it inside a paper bag, and set it on the highest shelf of the wardrobe. Not because she was angry at the 3 neighborhood matrons, but because she didn't want to see it every day and remember the feeling of that night. The feeling of wearing clothes that weren't hers, standing in a room that wasn't hers, speaking to people she hadn't chosen to meet. She sat down on the edge of the bed, her back straight, both hands resting on her knees, and made a decision. Not a grand decision shaped like a declaration or an oath. It was the kind of decision that arrived in silence, when a person had endured long enough and finally didn't explode, but settled all the way to the bottom, and from that bottom looked upward and saw everything clearly. From now on, Meredith would move her own pace. She wouldn't wait for someone to bring her evidence. She wouldn't wait for someone to protect her. She wouldn't wait for someone to give her permission. She wouldn't wear clothes someone else had bought to go somewhere someone else had chosen. She had the brown envelope in the drawer. She had 6 real estate transactions on her phone. She had a name, Bryce Gallagher, and she had a mind that had once been paid hundreds of dollars an hour to read contracts and find the line someone else wanted hidden. For the past 3 years, that mind had been washing clothes. But tonight, it received its old job back. The evidence Meredith needed didn't come from her phone or from public records. It came from Jolene Parks, the 25-year-old neighbor who lived in the second-floor apartment directly above the laundromat, on a Thursday night when Meredith was sitting at the cashier counter, rewriting the list of what she knew and what she still didn't know in an old notebook. Jolene knocked on the laundromat door close to 10 o'clock at night. Meredith opened it and found her standing outside, still wearing her cleaning uniform, holding her phone in one hand, her face carrying the look of someone who had just seen something she didn't yet know what to do with, but knew for certain she couldn't pretend she hadn't seen. Jolene Parks had been married for less than a year. She worked 2 jobs, during the day at a supermarket checkout counter, and 3 nights a week cleaning for a real estate company downtown. That company belonged to Bryce Gallagher, though Jolene hadn't known Bryce's name until that very night. To Jolene, it was only the office she was hired to clean, vacuuming, mopping floors, emptying trash cans, locking the door when she was done. She didn't read the papers on people's desks because she had no reason to read them until that night. Jolene told Meredith that when she was cleaning the large conference room, she saw a map spread out on the table, the kind of large printed map people used in project presentations. That map showed the entire South Side, and on it, each lot, each commercial property, had been marked in color. Jolene said she didn't understand the full meaning of the colors, but she recognized one thing. The address of Meredith's laundromat sat inside a square shaded in red. Beside that square were the words, "Acquisition Target," and below it was a number Jolene guessed was the projected purchase price, along with a timeline column running from the current month to the end of the quarter. Jolene said she saw it, and her heart began to race, not because she was afraid, but because she knew Meredith, because she lived right above the laundromat, because every morning she heard the washing machines running beneath her, and that sound had become so familiar that if one day it stopped, she would know something had happened. Jolene took pictures of the map with her phone, quickly, 2 photos, then kept cleaning as if nothing had happened. She finished the job, locked the office door, and went straight back to the South Side. Meredith looked at the 2 photos on Jolene's phone. She zoomed in, studying every detail. The red square marking her laundromat sat in the middle of the map, surrounded by other squares, some crossed out with a marker, meaning completed, others still untouched, meaning pending. Her shop belonged to the pending group. And beside that square, besides the words "Acquisition Target" and the projected price, there was also a small handwritten note Meredith had to zoom in all the way to read. Lease expires Q4. Tenant unaware of supplemental clause. The lease expired in the 4th quarter. The tenant was unaware of the supplemental clause. Meredith set Jolene's phone down on the counter and sat still. Not still because she was shocked. Still because everything, the brown envelope under the rolling door, the strange appendix without her signature, the 6 property transactions on the business registry website, Bryce's smile at the fundraiser, the question, "Do you know who owns the property where the laundromat is located?" The 3 invitations, the outfit hanging from the hook, the neighborhood's changed eyes, and Gloria's circling voice the afternoon before had all just arranged themselves into a complete picture. And that picture was so clear that Meredith didn't need to guess anything anymore. Her laundromat was the target. Bryce Gallagher had planned to take over this property before he ever walked into Delia's hair salon. The supplemental appendix in the contract had been prepared in advance. The fundraiser was the stage. The 3 neighborhood matrons were the bridge. And Meredith, the laundromat owner who had paid rent on time for 34 consecutive months, was the chess piece Bryce had already named on the map before she even knew she was in the game. Suspicion had become confirmation. She was no longer guessing. She knew. Meredith looked at Jolene, the young woman standing beside the cashier counter, with eyes still slightly anxious because she didn't know whether what she had just done was right. Meredith said, "You just gave me the thing I haven't had for 3 years. Evidence." Jolene asked, "What are you going to do?" Meredith didn't answer right away. She opened the notebook on the counter, the pen still clipped to the page she had been writing on before Jolene knocked, and began to write. She wrote quickly, writing with the habit of someone who had once taken notes through hundreds of meetings, writing not to remember, but to organize. Because when events lay on paper in the correct order, they began pointing toward a direction the mind hadn't yet seen. Jolene stood still, watching Meredith write, and she realized that the woman sitting in front of her looked different from the laundromat owner she greeted every morning. Not different on the outside, different on the inside, as though something that had been asleep for a very long time had just awakened completely. 2 days after the night Jolene brought over the photos of the map, Meredith closed the laundromat an hour earlier than usual. She wore ordinary clothes, not the outfit from the fundraiser, not her laundromat clothes, just clean jeans and a light jacket, then took the bus to West Randolph Street. She stood in front of the Italian restaurant at 7 o'clock in the evening, looked inside through the glass, saw that the restaurant had no customers left, and stepped in. The guard at the back of the restaurant stopped her before she could pass through the kitchen area. He was nearly a head taller than she was, and he looked at her with the flat eyes of a man who didn't need to ask what she wanted, because the answer would be no, no matter what she wanted. Meredith looked straight into his eyes and said, "Tell Mr. Gallagher that the woman who owns the South Side laundromat has something he needs to see." The guard didn't answer. He looked at her for a few more seconds, then turned away, walked toward the back, and disappeared behind the wooden door. Meredith waited. She stood straight, both hands resting at her sides, not crossing her arms because crossed arms meant defense, not putting her hands in her pockets because hands in pockets meant trying to appear relaxed. She simply stood there, with the posture of someone who knew where she was and knew what she had come here to do. The wooden door opened. The guard nodded, and Meredith stepped into the back room. Reed was sitting behind the old oak desk, in the same position where he had sat when Whitmore came to ask for a rent reduction, the same closed laptop set off to one side, the same cup of coffee gone cold. He watched Meredith enter and didn't stand, didn't gesture toward a chair, didn't say anything. He only looked. Meredith pulled out the chair and sat down across from Reed without waiting to be invited, because she hadn't come here to be invited. She had come here to make an offer, and a person making an offer didn't wait for someone else to open the door. She opened it herself. Meredith didn't take out her phone. She didn't show him the map photos. She didn't place anything on the desk. She looked at Reed and began to speak, in a voice that 3 years of washing clothes had covered over but hadn't erased. The voice of someone who had once stood before a review board and presented a 200-page file without needing to look at her notes. She said, "You already know what your brother is doing on the South Side. I know you know because I heard you say it over the phone in my laundromat a few months ago, but there is something you don't know, or something you know but don't yet have evidence for. Bryce is using his legitimate real estate company to transfer properties owned by your organization into the name of his company. He isn't gathering real estate on the South Side. He's taking your real estate through paperwork, through contracts, through supplemental clauses you may never have read because you trusted your brother." Reed didn't interrupt. He sat there listening, his face unchanged, but Meredith noticed that his finger on the tabletop had stopped. The finger that had been tapping lightly out of habit now lay completely still. That was Reed's only reaction, and to someone who didn't know how to read, it would have meant nothing. But to Meredith, who had sat across from hundreds of negotiating partners and learned to read what people didn't say, that stopped finger meant she had just hit the place he didn't want hit. Meredith continued, "I'm a former lawyer. My license was taken, but no one took my knowledge. I know how to read real estate transaction records. I know how to trace chains of transfer. I know how to find which line in a contract was written to conceal rather than clarify. I can help you. Hold on to the assets. Bryce is quietly moving out of the organization. In exchange, I need 2 things. First, you protect my laundromat property, make sure the lease is extended long-term, and make sure no one can use any supplemental clause to terminate it early. Second, you help me reach a legal team strong enough to file my 4th appeal to restore my license to practice law with new evidence." She finished speaking and sat still. No more. No explanation. No persuasion. She had placed the offer on the table in words, clear, complete, and now it was Reed's turn. The room was silent. Reed looked at her, not with the same look from their first meeting at the fundraiser, but with a different one, the look of a man weighing again the weight of something he had thought he had already finished weighing. Then he asked, his voice still even but half a beat slower, "You know who I am. You know what I do. You came here alone, with no one knowing, sat across from me, and proposed a deal. Why aren't you afraid?" Meredith answered without needing to think, because she had carried this answer with her from home, "Because I lived with someone more dangerous than you for 5 years. That man lay right beside me every night, and I didn't know. At least you have rules. And you don't pretend to be someone else." Reed didn't answer right away. He looked at her a while longer, longer than most people could bear without turning away, but Meredith didn't turn away. She had sat before the board that took her license and hadn't turned away. A man sitting behind a wooden desk in the back room of an Italian restaurant wasn't the hardest thing she had ever faced. "At last," Reed said. "Next Tuesday, prepare the complete legal file for me. Every transfer transaction you can find, arranged chronologically, with analysis attached. I want evidence, not speculation." He didn't shake her hand, didn't say "fine" or "I agree," or any word that meant commitment, only an order, clear, with a deadline, with specific requirements. But Meredith understood. In Reed Gallagher's language, an order meant he had decided. And this decision, this time, stood on her side. Meredith stood, pushed the chair back in, and walked out without looking back. She didn't say thank you because this wasn't a favor. This was an agreement. And in an agreement, no one owed anyone gratitude. They only owed each other results. The following Tuesday, exactly as Reed had said, Meredith sent a 43-page file to the back room of the Italian restaurant. She didn't deliver it herself. She sent it through one of Reed's men, a man whose face she knew but whose name she didn't, a man who came to the laundromat, took the envelope, and left without saying a single word except, "Mr. Gallagher will receive it." 43 pages. Arranged chronologically, each transaction separated into its own section, each section including the name of the property, the address, the transfer date, the name recorded in the Gallagher organization's books, and the name listed on the paperwork for Bryce's real estate company. Beside each section was Meredith's brief analysis, written in precise legal language, pointing out the irregularities in each transaction, how many % below market value the transfer price had been, which clause in the contract had been written to legitimize the movement of assets from one side to the other without the consent of the actual owner. Meredith had worked 6 consecutive nights to complete that file. 6 nights sitting at the cashier counter after closing the shop, searching on her phone, comparing the results with public records, writing analysis in her notebook, then typing it again on the old laptop she had bought from the second-hand shop at the head of the street. She wrote like someone rewriting the part of her life the system had taken away. Not rushed, not careless. She dived into the records with the same intensity that had once made her the most meticulous lawyer at her firm. Every line, every comma was a clue in a mystery she was born to solve. Reed read all 43 pages in one night, and the next morning he called Bryce. He didn't explain why. He only said, "Come to the restaurant, tonight." 7 o'clock. Bryce arrived on time, because Bryce always arrived on time when Reed called, not out of respect, but because he was smart enough to know that Reed Gallagher didn't summon people for small talk, and being late for Reed wasn't rude. It was a mistake. That night, in the back room of the Italian restaurant, there were only 2 people, no men, no lawyers, no one except the Gallagher brothers, sitting across from each other at the oak desk their father had left behind. That desk had witnessed many conversations since their father's death, but never one like tonight. Reed placed the file on the desk, right in the middle, between the 2 of them. He didn't open it, didn't explain what it was. He simply set it down and looked at Bryce. Bryce looked at the file, then at Reed, and in his eyes there was a moment Meredith would have recognized at once if she had been there. The moment of a man who had just understood that the secret he had been keeping was now on someone else's table. But Bryce was Bryce. He didn't let that moment last. He swallowed it as quickly as someone drinking cold water, then asked in an ordinary voice, "What is this?" Reed answered, 14 property transfer transactions from my organization to your company over the past 2 years, below market value. Supplemental clauses added without my signature. A complete legal file with line-by-line analysis. Reed continued, his voice still even, neither rising nor falling, neither fast nor slow, like a man reading a statement he had already finished writing and only needed to speak aloud. You used 3 women on the south side as a bridge to the laundromat owner. You used her laundromat as the next target in your takeover plan. You used my organization as a screen to transfer assets into your name. You did all of that without saying a word to me. Bryce opened his mouth. He spoke about family. He said, the Gallagher organization was the inheritance of both brothers, that what he was doing was shared growth, asset diversification, protecting the family by moving part of the assets out of a risk zone and into legitimate channels. He used the word share. He used the word together. He used the words, Dad would have wanted this. Those words fell into the room like counterfeit coins, looking real but not making the right sound. Reed listened from beginning to end. He didn't interrupt, didn't argue, didn't change expression. He listened until Bryce finished speaking, listened to the last sentence fall into the silence between the 2 brothers, and then he stood. Slowly. He buttoned his suit jacket from bottom to top with both hands, with the care of a man performing a ritual he had already decided on before he ever stepped into the room. Then Reed spoke, and this was the only time in the entire conversation that his voice changed. Not louder, not angrier, but heavier. as though every word had been placed on the desk with a weight calculated in advance. You have 24 hours to return every document for the Southside properties. After those 24 hours, you have nothing more to do with this organization. Not because I'm angry with you, because I don't trust you anymore. And in my work, losing trust is more dangerous than losing money. Reed walked out of the room. He didn't look back, didn't wait for Bryce to answer, didn't shake his hand, didn't say anything more, didn't give Bryce the chance to speak the final sentence. The conversation ended when Reed wanted it to end, and Reed wanted it to end exactly there, at that sentence. Bryce remained seated alone in the back room of the Italian restaurant, across from his father's oak desk, with the 43-page file on top of it. A file a laundromat owner had written over 6 nights. He sat there longer than he had intended, because he was calculating. Bryce Gallagher always calculated, and what he was calculating now wasn't how to apologize or how to come back. It was how to retaliate. Because Bryce had been cut off from the Gallagher organization, but his real estate company still existed. The ownership documents for the laundromat property were still inside the legal system. And in the legitimate world, where Reed's power couldn't reach, Bryce still had pieces on the board. As soon as Meredith learned that Reed had finished dealing with Bryce, she did the thing she had been thinking about since the night Jolene brought the photos of the map, but had waited for the right moment to do. She texted Delia, Gloria, and Pearl, sending each of them the same short message. Can you come to the laundromat after 8 o'clock tonight? I have something I need to say. All 3 came. Delia arrived first, exactly at 8 o'clock, because Delia was someone who was never late to a meeting she considered important, and the tone of Meredith's message was enough for her to know that this meeting mattered. Gloria arrived a few minutes later, her breathing a little quick as though she had walked fast, her eyes moving from Meredith to Delia and then around the laundromat as if searching for clues about what was about to happen. Pearl arrived last, silent as always, sat down on the plastic chair near the door, placed her hands on her lap, and waited. The laundromat was closed. The washing machines were off. Only half the lights were on, bright enough for them to see one another's faces, but not bright enough to hide anything. Meredith stood behind the cashier counter. She looked at the 3 women sitting in front of her and remembered the afternoon when they had brought the invitations and the outfit to the laundromat. Their faces eager, their steps confident, their voices belonging to people who believed they were opening a door for someone. She remembered, and she wasn't angry, because being angry at these 3 women would have been like being angry at the rain because she hadn't brought an umbrella. They hadn't made the rain. They had only been standing in the wrong place when it began to fall. Meredith took out her phone, opened the photo of the planning map Jolene had taken, then placed the phone on the counter and turned the screen toward the 3 women. She said nothing. She let them look for themselves. Delia stood up, walked to the counter, picked up the phone, and zoomed in on the image. Gloria stood behind Delia, looking over her shoulder. Pearl remained seated, but her eyes watched Delia's face, because Pearl didn't need to look at the map to understand. She only needed to see Delia's face to know what the map contained. Delia looked at the map photo for a long while. She saw the red square marking Meredith's laundromat. She saw the words acquisition target. She saw the other squares that had been crossed out, the properties already taken over, and she understood that she was looking at the blueprint of the man she had brought to Meredith. Delia set the phone down on the counter, slowly, then stepped back once. She said nothing. Gloria said, "Dear God." Only 2 words, but the way she said them, soft and hoarse, like breath caught in the middle of her chest, made those 2 words heavier than a whole speech. Meredith spoke. She spoke in a calm voice, neither rising nor falling, not trembling, not cold. It was the voice of someone who had prepared every sentence in advance, not because she was calculating, but because she knew that what she was about to say would change the way these 3 women saw themselves. And she wanted to make sure that change came from truth, not emotion. She said, "You wanted to help me keep this place. I know that, and I'm grateful for it, because your kindness was real. But this is the real plan of the man you connected me to. My laundromat wasn't something he wanted to help. It was the target he wanted to take. And without knowing it, you became the bridge that helped him get closer." The room fell silent. The clock on the wall behind the cashier counter ticked, the kind of sound no one usually heard, but now every tick was clear because there was no other sound to fill the space. Pearl was the first to speak. From the plastic chair near the door, she said in an even voice, with no excuse and no explanation, "We didn't know. That isn't an excuse. It is an admission." Pearl's sentence fell into the room and stayed there, heavy and true, because Pearl had said exactly what needed to be said, no more and no less. She didn't say, "We were deceived," because that would have placed the blame on someone else. She didn't say, "We're sorry," because an apology without knowing what would come next was only noise. She said, "We didn't know, and we admit it," because that was the only foundation firm enough to stand up from. Meredith nodded, accepting Pearl's words, then continued, "I'm not angry with you, but I want to say one thing, and I want you to hear it clearly. From now on, if anyone wants to help me, ask me what I need first. Don't decide to help and tell me afterward. Because sometimes what people bring and what someone truly needs are two very different things. And the space between those two things is where people like Bryce Gallagher step in." Gloria looked at Meredith, and for the first time since they had known each other, she didn't look at her with the eyes of an older woman looking at a younger one, but with the eyes of someone learning something she should have known long ago. She said, "Girl, I've lived 60 years, and no one has ever said that to me as clearly as you just did. I thank you for saying it." Delia still hadn't spoken since setting the phone down. She stood beside the counter, both hands gripping the edge, her eyes lowered to the worn, pressed wood surface. Delia Watts, the woman whose words the whole South Side treated almost like law, the woman everyone trusted, was standing in the laundromat of a 30-year-old woman and facing the truth that she had been used. At last, Delia lifted her eyes to Meredith. She didn't speak, she only nodded. A slow, deep nod, carrying the full weight of 61 years, lived on the South Side, and Meredith understood, because with Delia, a nod weighed more than any promise. It meant she had heard, she had understood, and she would remember. The three women left the laundromat in silence. No one said anything more. No one hugged. No one cried. They only stepped out into the South Side night with footsteps slower than when they had arrived, because they were carrying something heavier than they had carried in. That thing wasn't anger or shame. It was understanding. And understanding, when it comes late, is always heavier than when it comes on time. After the night she met with the three neighborhood matrons, Meredith had her first night since the brown envelope appeared under the rolling door when she slept for more than 4 hours straight. Not because everything was over, but because, for the first time in many weeks, she was no longer carrying everything she knew alone. The truth had been spoken, to the right people, at the right time, and though that truth was heavy, it became lighter once it was divided. But one thing was still there, sitting in the corner of her mind every time she thought back over the whole story from the beginning. The brown envelope. Who had sent it? That question had followed her from the very first evening, when Zoe came running from the back of the shop with the envelope raised high in her hand, all the way to now. She knew why the envelope had been sent, understood which plan the supplemental appendix belonged to, had seen the chessboard, and knew which piece she was on it. But she still didn't know who had slipped the envelope under the rolling door of the laundromat that night. It wasn't Bryce, because Bryce wanted her to know nothing until it was too late. It wasn't the three neighborhood matrons, because at that point, they hadn't known the real plan yet. It wasn't Jolene, because Jolene had only discovered the planning map many days later. And it wasn't Reed, because if Reed had wanted to warn her, he had other ways, more direct, more controlled, more like him than sliding an envelope under a door. A few days after the meeting with the three neighborhood matrons, Meredith had a chance to speak with Reed again. Not in the back room of the Italian restaurant this time, but at the laundromat, in the afternoon, when Reed's man came to pick up laundry on the weekly schedule. Reed didn't come with him, but he called Meredith right afterward, saying briefly that the paperwork for the Southside properties was being transferred back, and that his lawyer would contact her during the week about the appeal file for her law license. Before hanging up, Meredith said, "There's one thing I still don't understand. The first envelope, the copy of the lease with the strange appendix page, who sent it to me?" The other end of the line was silent for a moment. Not the silence of someone thinking of how to answer, but the silence of someone deciding whether to answer at all. Then Reed said, "It wasn't me." Meredith asked, "Then who?" Reed told her, and he told it briefly because Reed always told things briefly, in sentences placed beside one another, like bricks building a wall. No excess, nothing missing, each sentence one brick. In Bryce's real estate company, there was someone who had worked for Bryce from the beginning. This person managed transaction files and was the one directly preparing the transfer documents for the properties, including drafting the supplemental appendices Bryce requested to add to the leases. This person knew everything because his hands had typed everything, until Bryce pushed him out of a major deal. One of the transfer transactions Meredith had found in the public records, a deal he was supposed to receive a share of, but Bryce had decided that giving one person less meant keeping more for himself. That person was pushed out, without noise, without drama, simply that one day he came to the office and found that he no longer had access to the files. But before his access was cut off, he had copied some documents. Among them was the copy of Meredith's laundromat lease. Along with the supplemental appendix page, Bryce had secretly added without Meredith knowing. That person sent the envelope to Meredith, not because he wanted to help her. Reed made that clear. He said this person didn't know who Meredith was, didn't care how she lived, or what the laundromat meant to her. He sent the envelope because he wanted to ruin Bryce's plan. It was that simple. When a person is betrayed by someone he once trusted, sometimes the only act of retaliation within reach is making sure the betrayer's plan doesn't succeed. That envelope was an act of revenge, not an act of rescue. Meredith happened to be the recipient, not because she was special, but because her laundromat was the next target on the map, and sending the envelope there was the fastest way to throw sand into the gears of Bryce's machine. Meredith asked, "Where is that person now?" Reed answered, "No longer in Chicago." 4 words, and Meredith understood that those 4 words were all Reed would say about this person. Not because he didn't know more, but because what else he knew belonged to the part of the world Meredith didn't need to step into. She hung up and sat down on the plastic chair inside the laundromat, her phone still in her hand, and thought about the brown envelope. Thought about that evening, when Zoe had run out from the back with the envelope held high, grinning, thinking she had found a toy. Thought about the strange appendix page Meredith had read under the desk lamp that night, and thought about the person who had sent it. A person whose face she didn't know, whose name she didn't know. A person who had been betrayed and had chosen to retaliate by throwing her one fragment of the truth, not out of love or pity, but out of anger. And that fragment of truth, sent with the most selfish motive possible, had become the first brick Meredith used to rebuild everything. Life worked that way sometimes. Something sent with bad intentions could become the best thing the receiver had ever been given. Not because the intention changed, but because the receiver decided to use it differently from what the sender had wanted. Bryce wanted that appendix to remain in the dark until it was too late. Bryce's former man wanted that appendix to wreck the plan. But Meredith didn't follow either man's intention. She looked at that appendix and saw something neither of them had expected. She saw evidence. And evidence, in the hands of a former lawyer who had lost everything except the ability to read a contract, was more dangerous than any plan. Meredith set the phone down on the counter and whispered, to herself, to the empty laundromat, to the brown envelope that had been lying in the drawer since the first night. He wanted me to be afraid. Instead, he woke me up. Bryce Gallagher returned the Southside property documents to Reed's organization within the 24-hour deadline. But anyone who thought that meant Bryce had accepted defeat didn't understand Bryce. Bryce had been cut off from the Gallagher organization, yes. He had lost access to the network, lost the protection, lost the Gallagher name standing behind him. But his legitimate real estate company still existed, his business license still existed, and on the legal paperwork, several Southside properties still remained under his company's management system during the transition period, including the property that housed Meredith's laundromat. Bryce didn't need an underground organization to retaliate. In this case, he had something stronger, and that was legal authority. One evening, after Meredith had closed the shop and gone back into the apartment behind it, a group of 3 people in contractor uniforms came to the laundromat. They had a letter of authorization from the property management company, had a work order clearly stating routine maintenance for commercial premises, and they carried out the work exactly according to the paperwork. They changed the lock on the back door. They cut the power to the 3 industrial washing machines and the 2 dryers, listing the reason as electrical equipment safety inspection. And they left an envelope on the cashier counter. Inside was a copy of the lease agreement, along with a typed sheet of paper containing only one line. The contract expires in 30 days. No destruction, no physical confrontation. Nothing the police could call a violation of the law. Everything fell within the property owner's rights. That was the kind of attack Bryce was best at. An attack by paperwork and clauses. The kind where the person being attacked couldn't call anyone because, in black and white, everything was valid. The next morning, Meredith came to the laundromat at 6:30, just as she did every day. She pulled up the rolling door, stepped inside, and knew immediately. The lights in the shop wouldn't turn on because the power to the washing machines had been cut at the electrical panel. The lock on the back door had been changed, and her old key wouldn't fit. And on the cashier counter, right where she usually placed her notebook each day, was the white envelope with the 30-day line. Meredith stood in the darkened laundromat, looking from the electrical panel to the back door to the envelope on the counter, and she didn't call the police. She knew calling the police would mean nothing because everything had been done according to the law. She didn't cry either, not because she didn't want to cry, but because the past 3 years had taught her that tears couldn't fix a lock and couldn't turn the power back on. Instead, she took out her phone and began taking pictures. She photographed the electrical panel that had been cut off, photographed each switch, photographed the angle clearly. She went to the back door, photographed the new lock, even photographed the slight scratches on the doorframe left behind from the lock replacement. She returned to the counter, photographed the envelope, photographed the paper inside it, photographed the 30-day line. Then she opened her notebook, sat down on one of the plastic chairs meant for customers because the chair behind the counter was in the dark without light, and began to write. The date, the time, the condition of each item, a detailed description of what had been changed. She wrote in steady, clear handwriting, without rushing, exactly the way she had been trained when she was still a lawyer, because evidence only had value when it was recorded properly and at the proper time. Reed learned about it within 2 hours. His network on the South Side didn't need any official report. News moved through the neighborhood faster than any phone call, and by the time it reached Reed, he was already on his way to the laundromat. This was the first time Reed Gallagher had stayed long enough to observe the laundromat, unlike his brief visit months before. The last time, a few months earlier, he had only stood at the counter for a few minutes to pick up laundry. This time, he stepped inside, walked past the row of machines with the power shut off, looked at the electrical panel, looked at the back door with its new lock, looked at the envelope on the counter. He said nothing as he moved through the shop. Meredith sat on the plastic chair with the notebook on her lap, watching Reed walk around once before stopping in the middle of the laundromat. Then Reed took out his phone, made a single call, and said 2 sentences Meredith couldn't hear clearly because he spoke quietly and had his back turned to her. 2 sentences, no more. Then he hung up. He turned to Meredith and said, "From now on, this place has someone watching it. You don't need to know who." Meredith looked at him, set her pen down on the notebook, and said, "I didn't ask you to protect me." Reed didn't answer. Meredith continued, "And I've recorded everything. Every lock, every electrical switch, every piece of paper. You handle Bryce your way. I have mine. Mine holds up in court." She said that sentence in a voice that wasn't challenging and wasn't asking permission, but in the voice of someone presenting a fact she believed the person across from her needed to know. And Reed listened. He stood in the middle of the darkened laundromat, looking at the woman seated on the plastic chair with a notebook on her lap. And he looked at her in a way he hadn't looked at anyone in a very long time. Not with the eyes of a protector, because Reed protected many people, and that was an expression he knew how to use. But with the eyes of a man who had just realized that the person in front of him didn't need the thing he was used to giving. She didn't need someone to save her. She needed someone to stand beside her. And those 2 things, in Reed's world, were as different as night and day. Reed walked toward the door. Before stepping outside, he stopped, didn't turn around, only tilted his head slightly toward Meredith and said, "Bryce touched my property. That's my problem." Then he left. Meredith remained seated alone in the laundromat without power. She looked at the door Reed had just walked through and thought about the last sentence he had said. My property. He was talking about the premises. On paper, this property belonged to the Gallagher organization's system, and Bryce had touched it, which meant he had touched an asset Reed controlled. That was the clearest meaning. But there was another meaning inside that sentence, a meaning Meredith heard but wasn't sure Reed had intended. And perhaps Reed wasn't sure either. Because sometimes people say a sentence without knowing it holds more than they meant to put into it. Meredith didn't think about that sentence any longer. She opened her notebook and continued writing. Because no matter what my property meant, the lock still needed to be changed back. The power still needed to be restored. And the 30 days on that paper were already counting down. And Meredith Cole wasn't the kind of woman who sat waiting for the clock to run out. That evening, power had been restored to the laundromat. Reed's men had handled it within a few hours after he left. The electrician reconnected the power to the 3 washing machines and the 2 dryers, and the locksmith replaced the lock on the back door with a new one, this time handing the key directly to Meredith and to no one else. Everything was back in its proper place, at least physically. But Meredith knew that what had been violated wasn't only the lock and the electricity. It was the sense of safety she had spent 3 years building inside this small shop. That fragile feeling created by opening the laundromat every morning and locking it every night without anyone touching it, and now a hole had been punched through it that no lock could patch. Around 9 o'clock that night, Meredith sat on the plastic chair in front of the laundromat. She didn't sit inside because the place still smelled of machine oil from the repair work, and she needed air. The South Side street at 9 o'clock wasn't completely empty, but it wasn't crowded either. Music drifted from some apartment at the end of the row. A car passed now and then. A dog barked in someone's backyard. The ordinary sounds of a neighborhood moving into night. Meredith sat there and didn't think about anything in particular. Sometimes a person needed to sit without thinking, to let the mind grow quiet after a day when it had been forced to work too hard. Then a black car pulled up a few yards from the laundromat. The car door opened, and Reed stepped out. Alone, no men with him, no driver waiting. He closed the car door, stepped onto the sidewalk, and walked toward Meredith with the steps of a man, in no hurry, because there was nowhere else he needed to be. He didn't ask whether he could sit. He simply pulled over the remaining plastic chair, the one customers sat in during the day while waiting for their laundry, placed it beside Meredith's chair, leaving just enough space between them that they didn't touch, but were close enough to hear each other without raising their voices, and sat down. No one said anything. Meredith looked out at the street. Reed looked out at the street. The two of them sat side by side in front of the South Side laundromat at 9 o'clock at night and let silence do what silence does best, filling the space between two people with presence instead of words. A minute passed, maybe 2, maybe longer. Meredith didn't count because she didn't need to count. There are silences that make people restless and eager to break them, and there are silences people want to keep because they are more comfortable than any conversation. This silence was the second kind. Then Reed spoke, and his voice then was different from every other time Meredith had heard it. It wasn't the even, controlled voice of a man managing a room. It wasn't the cold, clipped voice of someone giving orders to Whitmore or to Bryce. It was the voice of a man who was tired in a way sleep couldn't cure, because it wasn't the body's exhaustion, but the exhaustion of someone who had carried something too heavy for too long and finally needed to set it down, even if only for a few minutes. In front of someone he trusted not to use it against him, Reed said, "I knew who Bryce was for a long time, before you brought me the file, before my men reported that he was acquiring properties. I knew, but I didn't want to believe it." He stopped, not so Meredith could answer, but so he could hear again what he had just said. Because sometimes people need to hear themselves speak a truth aloud before they can truly accept that it is real. Then he continued, "Because if I believed it, then I had to admit that the closest person I had left in this world was also the person who had taken the most from me. My father died and left this organization behind, left that desk in the back room of the restaurant, left everything for the two of us to divide. And Bryce took slowly, piece by piece, through paperwork, through the trust I gave him because he was my older brother. I saw it, and I chose not to look. Because when you see your own brother betraying you, what are you supposed to do? Cut him off, and you lose your brother. Keep him, and you lose yourself. So I chose not to look, until you sat across from me in the back room of that restaurant and said straight to my face the things I had been trying to pretend I didn't know." Meredith listened. She didn't turn to look at Reed, because she understood that Reed was saying things he could only say when no one was looking directly into his eyes. Some truths can only escape in the dark, when the person speaking doesn't have to face the listener's gaze, and Meredith was perceptive enough to know that in this moment, she should look at the street instead of at him. When Reed finished speaking, Meredith didn't comfort him. She didn't say, "I'm sorry," because she had nothing to apologize for. She didn't say, "It'll be all right," because she didn't know whether it would be all right, and she didn't say things she didn't know. She said the only thing she had the right to say, the thing she knew was true because she had lived through it. "I understand. My ex-husband was the same. 5 years lying beside someone I thought I knew, while that person used my name, my account, my trust to do things I knew nothing about. And when the truth came out, I asked myself why I hadn't seen it sooner. But the answer is simple. We don't see because we don't want to see. Knowing the truth and choosing silence, that's also a way of locking yourself up. I did that for 5 years." Reed turned to look at her, for the first time since sitting down in the chair, and Meredith felt that gaze on her face though she was still looking out at the street. She didn't turn back. Not because she was avoiding him, but because this moment didn't need two people looking at each other. It needed two people sitting beside each other, and knowing that the person beside them understood, truly understood, not in theory, but through scars. No one touched anyone. No one said, "I'm here for you," or "We'll get through this," or any of the sentences people use when they don't know what else to say. No one promised anything. No one declared anything. Just two people sitting on plastic chairs in front of a laundromat on the South Side. A man who controlled half of South Chicago and a woman who washed other people's clothes for a living, sitting beside each other in the dark. And for the first time in a very long while, neither of them was alone. That was something no organization could buy and no legal file could create. The presence of a person who understood you without needing you to explain. Meredith had lost that after the divorce. Reed had probably never had it. And tonight, on the South Side sidewalk, it arrived not because anyone had searched for it, but because two people happened to sit in the right place at the right time with the right wounds. After a long while, Reed stood. He rose slowly, like a man leaving a place where he wanted to stay longer, but knew that staying longer would change the meaning of having sat there. And he wasn't ready for that change. He walked toward the car. Before opening the door, he stopped at the edge between the darkness of the sidewalk and the glow of the streetlight, turned back to look at Meredith and said, "Your legal file, those 43 pages, better than anything my lawyers have ever done." Then he got into the car and left. Meredith remained seated for a while after Reed's taillights disappeared at the end of the street. She knew that sentence hadn't been a compliment. Reed Gallagher didn't compliment people. That sentence was his way of saying thank you without ever using the word thank you. His way of saying I see you without using the words I see you. The way a man accustomed to controlling everything admitted that there was one thing he couldn't control, and that thing was sitting on a plastic chair in front of a laundromat, holding a notebook, and not needing him to save her. Meredith stood, stacked the two plastic chairs together, pulled down the laundromat's rolling door, and went into the room behind it. She didn't smile. Not yet. That smile would come, but not tonight. Tonight, she only needed to know that she wasn't alone, and she knew. What happened after that didn't arrive in one grand moment or a single event. It came through many small things happening at once, like the changing of seasons, when no one can point to the exact day winter ends and spring begins, but one day people look outside and see that everything is different. Bryce Gallagher returned every Southside property document to Reed's organization before the 24-hour deadline Reed had set. He didn't call Reed to say he had returned them, didn't send a message, didn't ask for a meeting. The documents were sent through the real estate company's lawyer, packed inside a large envelope, delivered to the Italian restaurant in the morning by a courier who didn't know what he was carrying. That was how Bryce left, without noise, without drama, without a final confrontation or a final word, just a delivered envelope, and then silence. But that silence didn't mean Bryce had disappeared. It meant every door Bryce had once walked through in Reed's world closed at the same time. The people who used to answer when Bryce called no longer picked up. The partners who had once sat at the same table with Bryce at meetings began declining appointments. The relationships Bryce had built on the Gallagher name standing behind him, once that name no longer stood behind him, dissolved like salt in water, quickly and without leaving a trace. Bryce still had his real estate company, still had money, still had a name in the legitimate business world. But in Chicago, especially in South Chicago, there were things money couldn't buy and a name alone couldn't keep. Protection was one of them. And Bryce was now a man with a company, but no back behind him, a man with a name, but no shadow. In the world where he operated, that wasn't a small thing. Reed kept his word, not because Reed was the kind of man who kept promises in any moral sense, but because in his world, a spoken word was a contract, and breaking a contract cost more than honoring it. Meredith's laundromat property was moved into a 10-year long-term lease, signed directly with the asset management company under the Gallagher organization, with the rent kept at the old rate. No supplemental appendix, no early termination clause. Meredith read the new contract from beginning to end, twice, because she was someone who had learned that not reading a contract carefully was the fastest way to lose things you thought you had. The contract was clean, Meredith signed, and Reed did one more thing. He hired a major law firm in downtown Chicago, the kind of firm Meredith had once worked against when she was still practicing, to help her file the fourth appeal to restore her law license. This time, Meredith wasn't alone, writing the petition on an old laptop after closing the laundromat. This time, there was a legal team, new evidence collected and presented professionally, clear arguments proving that Meredith Cole had been unjustly implicated by association in her ex-husband's financial fraud case, and that revoking her license had been disproportionate to the true level of her involvement. Reed didn't tell Meredith he was doing it for her. He said he needed a good lawyer on the South Side, and she was the most reasonable choice. Meredith listened and understood that this was Reed's way of giving without making the receiver feel as though she was receiving. The three neighborhood matrons of the South Side changed too, in the way people who have lived 60 years change, without noise, without declarations. But surely, Gloria Marsh began asking before acting. When a family in the neighborhood was having a hard time and Gloria wanted to help, instead of deciding on her own how to help and then bringing it over the way she used to, she stopped by and asked, "What do you need? Tell me, and I'll see what I can do." It was a small change, but the distance between "I brought this for you" and "What do you need" was a distance Gloria had spent 60 years crossing. Delia Watts no longer accepted offers from strangers. When another investor came into the hair salon, introducing himself with a business card and a smile, Delia looked at the card, looked at the smile, and said, "I'll think about it." Then she called Meredith to ask her opinion before deciding anything. Pearl Hammond spoke even less than before, if such a thing was possible. But one afternoon, she stopped by the laundromat, stood at the counter, watched Meredith folding clothes, and said, "Next time someone wants to help you, I'll ask you first. I promise." Meredith looked up at her. Pearl said nothing more. She didn't need to, because from Pearl, a promise was already more than she usually gave anyone, and Meredith knew that. Then one day, about 3 weeks after everything with Bryce ended, Meredith opened the mailbox outside the laundromat and found an envelope from the law firm. She opened it, read it, and stood still in front of the mailbox for a long while. Her fourth appeal had been accepted by the review board for consideration. It wasn't a final decision yet. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't the restoration of her license. It was only the door that had slammed shut in front of her for the past 3 years. The door she had knocked on 3 times and been denied all 3 times, now opening just a crack, only a crack. But for someone who had been standing before a closed door for 3 years, even a crack was light. Meredith put the letter into the cashier counter drawer, in the same place where the first brown envelope had once been. That drawer now held 2 things, an old envelope that had brought a threat and a new letter that brought hope. The same drawer, the same person, but a different stretch of life. A few months later, Meredith Cole's laundromat still opened at 6:30 every morning. The 3 industrial washing machines still ran, the 2 dryers still spun, and the smell of detergent mixed with warm air was still the first thing that greeted customers when they stepped through the door. But one thing had changed. Beside the laundromat, in the place that used to be a small storage room where Meredith kept bags of clothes no one had come to pick up yet, there was now another door. The door wasn't large. It was painted white, and above it hung a small wooden sign, handwritten in black marker, the letters leaning slightly, because the person who wrote them hadn't used a ruler. If you need someone to listen, the door is always open. It was the free legal counseling office for the South Side community. Meredith opened it. Reed funded it. There was no large sign, no advertisement, no opening ceremony, or ribbon cutting. One day that door wasn't there, and the next day it was, the way spring arrives without anyone ringing a bell to announce it. Inside the small office, there was a desk, 2 chairs, a shelf of basic legal books, and a box of tissues. The box of tissues was something Meredith added herself, because she knew that the people who stepped through that door would bring stories that sometimes needed tears before they needed advice. Meredith hadn't gotten her law license back yet. Her 4th appeal was still under review, and that process needed time. But she didn't need a license to listen. She didn't need a license to help someone read and understand a lease. She didn't need a license to sit across from a woman afraid of losing her home and say, "Show me your papers. We'll read them together." That was what Meredith did every afternoon after closing the laundromat. She exchanged her laundromat apron for a shirt, stepped through the door beside it, and sat down at the desk. Some days people came, some days no one did. But the door was always open, exactly as the sign said. One afternoon, while Meredith was sitting in the office, reading through a file a neighbor had brought in that morning, the door burst open, and Zoe ran in. The little girl was laughing as she ran, holding a drawing made with colored pencils, her sandals slapping against the wooden floor, and saying in the clear voice only children have, "Mommy, I drew your laundromat." It has washing machines and the rolling door, and even a cat outside. Can I hang it on the wall? Meredith looked at the paper. The laundromat in Zoe's drawing had a red roof, though the real laundromat didn't have a red roof, had a chimney, though the real laundromat didn't have a chimney, and had a cat sitting in front of the door, though this neighborhood only had stray dogs. But the laundromat in Zoe's drawing had one thing the real laundromat had almost lost. It was there, steady and firm on the page, drawn by the hand of a child who believed it would always be there. And Meredith smiled. The first smile this story described. Not a big smile, not a radiant one. Just the corners of her mouth lifting, her eyes softening, and the whole face that for so many weeks had carried the careful expression of someone always calculating the next step, now letting go. Only for a few seconds, but enough. She said, "Hang it up, sweetheart, right in the best spot." Zoe cheered, ran to the blank wall beside the bookshelf, and began trying to tape the drawing up. Meredith sat watching her daughter with the drawing and the roll of tape, and she thought, this is why. This was why she hadn't sold the property when Bryce made his offer. This was why she had spent 6 nights writing a 43-page file. This was why she had walked into the back room of the Italian restaurant and proposed a deal to a man the whole city knew no one should propose anything to. Because a child was hanging a picture on the wall and believing everything would be all right, because her mother had said it would be all right, and Meredith wouldn't let that sentence become a lie. Reed Gallagher never stepped through the door of that legal counseling office. Not once. He didn't belong to the world Meredith was building. Behind the white painted door with the handwritten wooden sign, that world was light, transparency, people sitting across from one another and telling the truth about what they needed. Reed's world lay on the other side, in the back room of the Italian restaurant, in 2-sentence phone calls, in decisions made with reasons no one but him knew. Those 2 worlds didn't intersect, but they stood beside each other, the way the laundromat and the counseling office stood beside each other, sharing one wall, each with its own door. But every month, an unnamed envelope was sent to the laundromat. Inside was the funding for the next month of the office. Enough money to pay for electricity and water, buy printer paper, and keep the door open. The monthly envelope arrived in silence, just like the first one. But where the first had been a weapon of revenge, these were tools of hope, a quiet partnership between 2 people who understood what it meant to rebuild from the ashes. The same laundromat, the same rolling door, but a completely different stretch of life. And sometimes, that stretch of life is separated by only one decision. The decision to open the envelope and read it instead of throwing it away. The decision to search instead of looking away. The decision to walk into the back room of the Italian restaurant instead of waiting for someone to come and save you. The decision to speak the truth instead of keeping silent for one more day. Meredith Cole had made those decisions. Not because she was braver than anyone else, but because she had been silent long enough to know that silence isn't always patience. Sometimes, silence is a prison we build for ourselves, then live inside for so long that we forget the key is still in our own hand. Freedom begins when we choose to speak the truth, not because someone gives us permission, but because we decide that we deserve to be heard. Meredith's story ends here, but perhaps it won't end here for you. Perhaps while listening, you thought of someone, or thought of yourself, some envelope in your own life that you have opened or still haven't dared to open, some sentence you swallowed because you thought you weren't important enough to say it aloud. If this story touched you, please like and share it so more people can hear it. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, this is the moment, because the next stories will be even better. How did this story make you feel? Which character made you think the most? Write it in the comments. We read every line, and we always want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart, because every story is only truly complete when there is someone to tell it and someone to listen. We wish everyone watching this video strong health, a joyful life, and peace every single day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.